Okay. All right, IBUS 75 Test 2. The website, and we've talked about this before, that logistics and supply chain are a subset of the marketing function in a business. In spite of the rhetoric out of our current federal administration that's trying to say America first, we're operating in a global environment right now. Marketing has 4 P's: product, place, price, and promotion. Place is the one where it talks about where you're going to have the product, where you're going to sell that product. Well, the way you get it from where you make it to where you sell it is called logistics. Logistics is the function of a business that relates to the physical distribution of the product. LA Long Beach is the key import port in the United States. 40% of all cargo comes through the port of LA Long Beach. The main reason for that is its proximity to the manufacturing centers, which are in Asia. It has deep water ports, and it has a substantial infrastructure, highway and rail infrastructure, that goes east to the Midwest and the East Coast. A company that recently went out of business, went bankrupt, Toys R Us, probably 30, 35 years ago, created a retailing model based on pool supply chain. In other words, what used to happen is a manufacturer would produce tires in a factory, let's say in Japan, and they would produce tires to optimize the productivity of the manufacturing plant. And there was no correlation to whether or not the tire would get sold or not. They would just produce them, and then they would put them on ships, and they would end up in warehouses, and they would sit in warehouses until customers ended up wanting to buy them. That's push. Well, it optimizes manufacturing, but there's a carrying cost, all that inventory cost, while you're waiting for it to sell. Toys R Us, many, many years ago, said, nah, what we're going to do, because they're in a kind of different business, is we're not going to order a product until we actually sold it. So they would keep track on their cash register how many times they sold a Ken doll, and once they sold 100 Ken dolls, they'd order another 100 Ken dolls, and then that would work back in their inventory. That's called pool supply chain. And that's the direction almost everybody's gone now, including Amazon. It's a great example of it. If you take a tour down to the Port of LA and Long Beach, there's 2 major classes of ships that show up there. One has containers stacked all over it, and the other ones are big oil tankers that bring oil in to go into the refineries that we have here in Wilmington and around the area. I get asked on a pretty regular basis what uniquely defines a particularly advantageous logistics network, right? The easiest way to describe it is you want to create a logistics system that's highly reliable first, which means much like Amazon, and it's cost effective, aka I'm back to Amazon, right? Highly reliable, 2 days it's there, pretty what, $9.95 a year or something like that. Okay? Amazon's done a good job of making my point. Okay, so these big container ships, if let's say the container ship holds 1,000 containers, right? And there's 1,000 containers on the dock that need to be loaded onto the ship. If in the 1,000 containers all have different weights to them, right? If you just randomly put them on the ship without thinking about where they're going to be discharged, when they need to be discharged, because the ship typically goes to multiple ports, you have to take into consideration that that ship, much like an airplane, has what's called a stability that they have to be aware of. Because if you put too much weight on the top and not enough on the bottom, the ship rolls, goes over to the side. Same thing with an airplane. If you get on an airplane and there's only like 50 passengers on the airplane, they have a tendency to have you sit in a block so that they can weight and balance the airplane so that it can fly better. That's called stability. Even though I mentioned that logistics is the physical movement of product, it's not, and it's on trucks and trains and airplanes and rail cars, which are all what we call assets. It used to be that all you focused on was the assets, but now it's the combination of the assets and the processes that we put in place to integrate those different assets. In the warehousing business, you have a lot of part-time, temporary, entry-level positions. And there's cultural diversity in those entry-level positions. It's important that you consider the differences in individual cultures in managing a workforce. Because different cultures have different concepts, right? And the more sensitive you are to that, the more reliable you're going to have a workforce. One of the other, when I was in the hospitals 5-6 years ago, about half the nurses that treated me were what were called registry, which means they weren't employees of the hospital. They would come in and fill in gaps, so they were kind of temporary workers. Then the full-time workers were scheduled in. They had to be there every Tuesday from noon to 8 or whatever, right? And what I found was that the registry nurses were the better nurses because they weren't angry about having to work that day. Because the registry nurse, they want to go skiing, they then controlled their schedule, right? And what's critical is for the hospital in that particular case to manage both of those groups the same so that the patient, me, the customer, is getting the appropriate treatment. If you consider those two nursing groups, if you're the manager of the nursing staff, if you consider them not as employees, but consider them as tools that create utility for the patient and focus on the patient's need or the customer's need, then your management practices should take that into consideration. As I mentioned earlier in my other class, every business, the CEO or the owner has to be an expert in revenue generation and in technology. Technology is changing how we're doing things so rapidly as it relates to productivity that if you don't know it, you're suspect then to people selling you, some swampland in Florida as it relates to technology. There's two ways of getting freight moved across an ocean. One is in an airplane, very fast, very small. One is on a ship, very slow, very big. The ship is big and slow, but it's very inexpensive. The airplane is fast and small, but very expensive. Domestically, the most cost-effective way of moving freight domestically within the United States is via rail. As long as you're within 250 miles of a major rail route, Chicago, Kansas City, New Jersey, right? But if you're in Fargo, North Dakota, right, trucking ends up being the more cost-effective way. But for the majority of the cargo moving, rail is the most cost-effective way to domestically move freight. The other thing, we talked about the Panama Canal. Hopefully I talked about the Panama Canal. Several a decade ago, they decided they're going to expand the Panama Canal to take what was called post-Panamax ships. Post-Panamax meant that it was a ship that was too big to go through the Panama Canal. And back then, 12,000 TEU ships, which was the largest container ships, TEU stands for 20-foot equivalent, couldn't enter the Panama Canal, so they spent a couple $1 trillion expanding the Panama Canal to get the big ships through. Well, before they got done, the ocean carriers came out with 18,000 TEU ships that could no longer go through the Panama Canal. I think we got it. Thank you very much.